Market Mantra. Market Mantra. Market Mantra. Market Mantra. Market Mantra. Market Mantra.
This is All India Radio. Good evening and welcome to this Wednesday edition of Market Mantra, the program in which we give you a complete update on the economic, business and stock market news of the day. I am Gaurang Dhawanlal and with me is my co-anchor in Hindi, Vishal Sharma.
नमस्कार। मार्केट मंत्र में आप सभी सुनने वालों का बहुत बहुत स्वागत। प्रतिदिन की तरह आज भी हम देश और दुनिया से आर्थिक, व्यापारिक और शेयर बाजार के ताजा समाचार आप तक लाएंगे और उन पर चर्चा भी करेंगे। चर्चा के लिए आज स्टूडियो में आमंत्रित हैं आर्थिक विश्लेषक जयंता दास। जयंता दास, नमस्कार। मार्केट मंत्र में आपका स्वागत। शुक्रिया। और सबसे पहले हेडलाइंस के साथ हैं गौरव धवनलाल।
Thank you, Vishal, and Jayanta, welcome to the program. We begin with the headlines. Domestic stocks witnessed modest gains amid mixed global cues. Sensex closes above 62,650 points. Nifty settles above 18,650 level. Rupee strengthens 35 paise against the US dollar. And Brent crude prices hover around $81.50 per barrel.
वैश्विक शेयर बाजारों के मिले जुले संकेतों के बीच घरेलू शेयर बाजारों में हल्की तेजी। सेंसेक्स 62,650 से अधिक पर हुआ बंद। निफ्टी 18,650 के स्तर से ऊपर पहुंचा। रुपया हुआ डॉलर के मुकाबले 35 पैसे मजबूत और ब्रेंट कच्चे तेल की कीमतें $81.50 प्रति बैरल के आसपास कर रही कारोबार। कार्यक्रम में बात सबसे पहले शेयर बाजार की। वैश्विक शेयर बाजारों से प्राप्त मिले जुले रुझानों के बीच प्रमुख घरेलू शेयर बाजारों में आज बढ़त का रुख रहा। सेंसेक्स 62,650 के निशान से ऊपर, जबकि निफ्टी 18,650 के स्तर से ऊपर बंद हुआ। बॉम्बे स्टॉक एक्सचेंज का सेंसेक्स 145 अंक बढ़कर 62,678 पर बंद हुआ। नेशनल स्टॉक एक्सचेंज का निफ्टी भी 52 अंक की वृद्धि से 18,660 पर पहुंच गया। व्यापक बाजार में बीएसई मिड कैप इंडेक्स 0.59% और स्मॉल कैप इंडेक्स 0.68% बढ़त में रहे।
The Sensex and the Nifty today witnessed gains amid mixed cues from global share markets. The BSE Sensex finished above the 62,650 level, while the Nifty settled above the 18,650 mark. The BSE Sensex climbed 145 points to close at 62,678 points. The Nifty also gained 52 points to end at 18,660. In the broader market at the BSE, the mid-cap index rose 0.59% and the small-cap index ended 0.68% up. In the Sensex pack, 21 companies posted gains while 7 logged losses. Tech Mahindra was the top gainer as it added 1.8%, followed by Tata Steel, which surged 1.7%. NTPC rose 1.6% and SBI added 1.4%. On the other hand, Nestle India declined 1.7% and ICICI Bank slipped 1.2%. Bharti Airtel fell 1.1% and Asian Paints ended 1% down. In sectoral indices at the BSE, 18 out of 20 sectors gained while FMCG fell 0.4%. The metal sector gained 1.6% and the realty index rose 1.4%. Capital goods and IT both indices surged 0.9% each. The overall breadth of the BSE trade was positive as shares of 1,996 companies gained while 1,548 fell. Shares of 133 companies remained unchanged. So, Jayanta, inflation seems to be under control. Even in the US, it seems to be under control, more towards a declining trend. In India, of course, we have the figures with us. The central bank rate hikes have kind of more or less stabilized or are going towards more moderate levels. So do you think the worst is over and India, the Sensex, at least in India, is steadily gaining because it goes up much and comes down marginally? So the it's pushing the bottom level higher.
Well, yeah, I mean, the general drift over the last 4 to 6 weeks based on two factors. One is not only the domestic factors, but even the U.S. consumer price inflation factors and all. There has been a tendency to believe that inflation, the peak of inflation has been reached, and maybe we are either tapering down, or maybe a much more better scenario where we might think of a bit of falling levels from here. Of course, I think you have news of our wholesale price index performing fabulously well this particular month in terms of good news of having been brought down. But on the whole, the markets, specifically the recent momentum in the markets, have been basically inspired by what is happening in terms of US markets. And I understand the Fed is going to have a press conference on one of the final meetings this particular calendar year. And 2 p.m. local time in US, on the Eastern Coast, I think Mr. Powell is going to brief the press. Now, there are two aspects which I personally feel, Gaurang, is to be noted here. One is, it's always important, as we all know, that with whatever, even forget the rate cuts or rate hikes, whatever directions when the Fed speaks of, the global market reacts and, has been moves and shifts and sharps.
Right.
The important point also is, I was listening to a lot of close analysts in the US markets or even global markets. And what they were telling is something very interesting. They said, forget about Fed taking a quantitative leap upwards or downwards or whatever. The tone of the press conference also sets, the whole journalists who are attending those press conferences will trigger around a global, reaction to how the tone will be. So even if he is doing a 75 basis point hike, when Mr. Powell addresses in that press conference, if he has a very hawkish tone, I think that also sets the pace of, where it should go, and sometimes there is an overreaction to it. What most observers believe this time is, and there was the poll also, as it always happened, it would be around 50 basis points, and the markets and even our domestic markets have gone around that particular factor, expecting a 50 basis point rate hike from here. But there are two factors once again to look forward to when we're talking of US markets. One is the inflation levels are still between 4 to 6% levels and not at the 2% levels. I'm talking of US markets over here. So that has not happened.
To this level, actually.
Yeah, and it has not happened. So Fed expects it to be at 2% levels. And secondly, Fed traditionally, if you see in the recent past, last 3-4 years, despite whatever short-term, quantitative milestones the market is covering, entering, or recuperating in that sense, Fed's overall stance remains the same. So I strongly believe that the interest rate hikes obviously would be there. Now it's just a matter of words in terms of whether we call it a hawkish, dovish, or a moderate move or whatever call it. But a 50 basis point is what the market is expecting. So if it's more than that, the market should overreact once again. There would be a crash. If it remains at 50, some of the markets would remain where they are because it has been already, built in over the last 3-4 days of trade, including in India's trade. Or some of the markets might, have a small slip. So this is how the year is going to affect globally. Now coming back to India, because we are in India and we are discussing Indian stock markets over here.
Right.
The important part is RBI also has taken a stance of how the GDP will be. They have, I think, lowered the GDP growth estimates by a few basis points. And the domestic factors, specifically the inflation, the wholesale price inflation, has shown a phenomenal performance, specifically in the month of November, led by food grains. So that's a very critical factor for me, where the food grain prices are headed, because I understand the existing Rabi season has been quite good in terms of expected productions and things like that. And we did a long discussion last week in these studios itself of how, we are now taking a food grain security as a normal, natural thing. I remember 20 years ago, we used to discuss food grain stocks almost every day, where the stocks are heading, how it will be managed and things like that. So now it's almost a normal situation for us, expecting in behind of our back that this is going to remain stable. There's no food grain security issue at all.
That's a tremendous movement.
That's
actually
a tremendous move
DNA
psychologically. So, India is no more discussing whether what the buffer stock should be, whether there's a concern on the buffer stock or not. And I think that speaks of a huge quantum jump of a nation, when a nation stops thinking of buffer stock issues. It's just like when a nation, there are a lot of economists still in the world which actually on an hourly basis are looking at their gold, holdings and things like that, because whether they have to go and take pledge in the market, including our immediate neighbor Sri Lanka. So those issues are still there, and unfortunately economies go through such cycles, go through such pressures, challenges. In India's case, we are way beyond that, thank God, in terms of a performing economy, in terms of strong policies which has brought us to this particular level.
This level of resilience, and I think that
Absolutely. And when we were expecting, the COVID to create an havoc, which has done globally, but the impact in India has been, as we have all seen, while it has obviously created a dent, created an effect, people have lost jobs, but not to that extent where we say that India, the whole story of recovery
is collapsing,
has,
right.
Instead of 6 to 12 months has taken 36 months. It has not happened so.
Right.
So the recovery has been quite fast enough. But the important factor remains, Gaurang, and let me, specify it over here in this program. Forget the rate losses, forget everything. What we tend to forget is when everyone is discussing interest rates and where they're heading, what we tend to forget is job losses. So environmentally, in terms of business environment, in terms of how markets are shaping up in terms of demand and supply, that's also a critical factor. Now, as we speak, we are talking of huge job cuts in the Silicon Valley, which they believe have not been seen in the last 5 to 7 years, even 10 years, if I may be ambitious in taking that length of a period.
Okay.
That's a very important factor. And I believe, for example, we have a huge Indian diaspora with H-1B visas. So if you don't have a job in the next 60 days, if you lose your job, you have to come back to India. So that's the stress. And that's a fact which India has to stand up to, which India has to face, because I believe that if the triggers are happening in Silicon Valley in terms of jobs, people losing their jobs, it will surely have a ripple effect by the start of spring next year.
Right.
Across, industries, right from your travel industry to everyone. Travel industry is a boom. Your four-wheeler sector is a boom. That's fine. But that's there in the horizon, surely. And very vividly. It's not something which we wish there in the horizon, it remains in the horizon. No. So, in fact, I read a story on Mr. Sundar Pichai, he is unable to fix up a sure shot scenario of what's going to come in the next 12 to 18 months. So, those are business makers, those are people who are into hard businesses, getting their every single dollar based on their plans. They know how markets are shaping up. So, policy focus is one side, how businesses, corporates are shaping up is something else. But let me not take away the lovely dream run at this point of time which Indian stocks, specifically some of my favorite sectors like banking, which I think for the last 10 years I've always said banking is one sector where you keep on investing and things like that. IT has softened, which is obviously given all these stresses in demand, all this fine. But India is having quite a good dream run. Despite the inflation and despite the interest rate hike.
Right.
Let's not take the pride away from this.
Right. You earlier spoke of this jumpiness and I think this reactive nature. Has it always been so? Because it's really, really magnified now, very small, like you said, a hawkish tone or a dovish tone. So this is not normal. And why do you think this has come in?
In terms of?
In terms of the market reacting,
See, that's what markets are all about.
But has it increased, this propensity to react and be more trigger happy?
See, we are in a era where news spreads instantly. When we started Market Mantra in year 2000, we had to wait for feed updates to come in the internet and then check out from there in terms of the updates. Now it's instant, so your reactions are instant, the markets are behaving instantly. So it's I think within 30 seconds to a minute sort of a instant levels of a reaction, right from East Coast when Japan opens up to the West Coast when California closes down. So obviously the reactions also will be, far more instantaneous, and any instant reaction, as you know, behaviorally is much more stronger. It can be without basis, but it always comes in as a much more stronger,
And sometimes
force.
the reaction is faster than the effect also.
Obviously, as I said, people do not take time to sink in, but then it also has happened so, the discussion platforms are now accessible and so wide that, the views, the opinions, they also keep on building up. And as I said, right from start, forget about the 50 basis point, forget about the 75 basis point. There is a strong view now within people where they say they would like to watch how Powell reads out, the rate hike, whether he's really, in a hawkish mode or he's in a softer tone or not. And they're telling that's how the market mood is going to set. And because that mood is once again a factor of, a behavioral attitude. It's not a factor of quantitative attitude. So I think it sinks in terms of what's the cause, what's the effect, and how it pans out. And as I said, stock markets are about irrational exuberance, and that's a very famous phrase, which is often been used by a very famous stock person who has got lovely books which are one of the globally assumed to be Bibles of stock market and stock markets, Mr. James Schaefer. So his books, and that's what I said. It sums up the reaction of what you said. Is all of irrational exuberance. So
जी, जयंत आपने बैंकिंग सेक्टर को बहुत आकर्षक बताया। बैंकिंग शेयरों में जो हम पिछले कुछ दिनों से जो तेजी का दौर देख रहे हैं, क्या ट्रिगर्स हैं इस तेजी के पीछे और क्या ये सस्टेन कर पाएगी? ये
देखिए, मैं मानता हूं बैंकिंग सेक्टर एक ऐसा स्टोरी है जहां पे लॉन्ग टर्म में कोई दो राय नहीं है कि इस सेक्टर में तेजी लगातार चलते रहेंगे। बिकॉज हमेशा जहां पे कोई भी देश का इकोनॉमिक स्ट्रक्चर जो बुनियादी ढांचा है उसमें जब ग्रोथ होता है उसमें बैंक चारों पहिया का सबसे मेन पहिया का हिस्सा होता है। अगर हम टू व्हील ड्राइव का बात करें तो आपको पता है मतलब कहां पे एनर्जी आ रहा है, तो बैंक का वो हिस्सा बैंक को होते हैं। अब सवाल ये रहा कि इंडियन बैंक्स का क्षेत्र में खास करके पीएसयूज में एक एनपीए का बहुत बड़ा विषय अभी भी है और वो भी कंट्रोल धीरे धीरे हो जाए, रातों रातों कंट्रोल हो नहीं सकता। 10 से 15 साल लगता है बैंक को वापस हेल्दी सिचुएशन में ले आने के लिए। और खास करके आपको ये भी पता है कि लगातार हर महीने हम लोग सुनते हैं किस तरह का डिफॉल्ट हो रहा है, किस अमाउंट में डिफॉल्ट हो रहा है। तो सरकार अपना नीतिगत रूप से अलग अलग पॉलिसीज लेके आए, एनसीएलटी वगैरह लेके आए, डिसोल्यूशन बोर्ड लेके आए। 15 साल पहले एक टैकल करने का जो उपाय था, आज काफी सारे इंस्ट्रूमेंट ज्यादा आ गया टैकल करने के लिए, जहां पे बैंक का हेल्थ भी मौजूद होता है, कंपनीज जल्दी सेल ऑफ हो रहा है। अगर क्रेडिटर्स चाहते हैं कंपनीज को सेल ऑफ करके वहां से कुछ पैसा रिकवरी हो जाए हेयरकट के द्वारा, तो उस तरह की चीजें घटनाएं घटे हैं। बड़े बड़े कंपनी बिके भी है और वो कंपनी धीरे धीरे वापस भी आ रहा है। तो बैंक्स के लिए मैं मानता हूं कि पहले जो सिचुएशन था आज से 10-15 साल पहले, वो सिचुएशन आज का तारीख में नहीं है। तो सबसे पहले सवाल ये है कि मजबूती, हाँ, बोथ पीएसयूज और प्राइवेट बैंक्स एक तो काफी तेजी से बढ़ रहे हैं। दूसरी बात यह है कि हम काफी सारी चीजें जो उम्मीद करते हैं बाकी दुनिया में नहीं होता सारी चीजें, जैसे हम आईएमपीएस सिस्टम, आप यहां पे पैसा 100 रुपया ट्रांसफर करें, 1 सेकंड में आप जिसके पास ट्रांसफर करें वो पहुंच जाए। यूएस में काफी मोटा फीस लगता है इस तरह का ट्रांसफर में। तो वो मेन में रूप दूंगा, मेन उसका कॉज है कि हमारा बैंक्स ने जो टेक्नोलॉजी और जिस कॉस्ट से टेक्नोलॉजी अडॉप्ट किया और ग्रो किया, एक ह्यूज इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर जो सेटअप हुआ। हमारा इंडिया का बैंकिंग इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर टेक्नोलॉजी वाइज आई थिंक इज वन ऑफ द बेस्ट इन द वर्ल्ड, बेस्ट इन द वर्ल्ड इन टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रांसफर, इन टर्म्स ऑफ कॉस्ट ऑफ सर्विसेज। हम आज का तारीख में लगातार आप देखें कि एटीएम चार्जेस लेकर हम शिकायत करते हैं, तरह तरह का चार्जेस लेकर शिकायत करते हैं। हम बोलते हैं एसएमएस बैंक भेज रहा है, हमें महीने में 22 रुपया काट रहा है उसका। तो ये सारी चीजें हम लोग को शिकायतें रहता है, विच इज फाइन, क्योंकि हम लोग का आदत पड़ चुका है कि पूरा सर्विसेज फ्री लेना बैंक का। और बैंक, हम बोलते हैं कि हमारा पैसा लेके बैंक अपना ब्याज कमा के जहां से जो करे, लेकिन सर्विसेज, जिस तरह का सर्विसेज दिया जा रहा है और जिस दर में दिया जा रहा है, मैं मानता हूं कि पूरा विश्व में इस तरह का दर में बैंकिंग सर्विसेज, क्या टेक्नोलॉजी का इतना अपग्रेडेशन कहीं पे भी। मैं काफी बैंकिंग करता हूं, यूरोपियन मार्केट्स के साथ करता हूं, यूएस मार्केट्स के साथ करता हूं। द फीस आर ह्यूज, कोई भी अगर आप इंस्टेंट बैंकिंग का बात करें तो ये सारी चीजें देखते हुए मैं मानता हूं कि टेक्नोलॉजिकल रूप से बैंक्स आर वेरी एडवांस एंड दैट्स द ह्यूज टेक्नोलॉजी हेल्प दे आर टेकिंग। आज अगर आप देखें बैंक ऑफ बड़ौदा को, अगर आप एचडीएफसी बैंक का साथ रखें, आईसीआईसीआई बैंक का साथ रखें, आपको बैंक ऑफ बड़ौदा से पीएसयू बैंक नजर नहीं आएंगे। उतना ही कॉम्पिटिटिव है मार्केट में, उतना ही जो उसके साथ ब्रांडिंग के साथ जो पहले था ना कि बैंक भाई अपना जहां पे स्ट्रांग है बैंक, वो सोचता है कि भाई मेरे पास तो लोग चल के आएंगे, वो स्थिति बदल गया। और पीएसयू बैंक सारे के रातों रात, मतलब पिछले 5, 7, 10 साल के अंदर अपना छवि पूरा बदल दिए इन टर्म्स ऑफ कंपटीशन, विच इज वेरी गुड। एट द एंड ऑफ द डे इज वेरी गुड। और पीएसयू बैंक्स में आप कहीं पे भी जाएंगे, उनका भी एक निर्णय है कि भाई प्राइवेट बैंक में जो सर्विस क्वालिटी लोग एक्सपेक्ट करते हैं, पीएसयू बैंक में जो वॉकिंग करेंगे वही सर्विस क्वालिटी यहाँ पे भी हम देंगे।
That's good. I think quality is so critical to bring in with scale.
And at the end of the day, Vishal, once again, one single line: when the whole sector is completely involved in qualitatively improving, businesses will follow and growth will happen. As simple as that. So I think that's what is ingrained in our whole banking sector as a performer.
Right, and we have Murphy's Law that when the discussion becomes very interesting, a break will follow.
Sure.
So time now for a short break. Listeners, stay with us.
अपने बिजनेस को बढ़ाने के लिए लीजिए आकाशवाणी का सहयोग और दीजिए उसे बुलंदियों के पंख।
आपका बिजनेस लोकल है या राष्ट्रीय, आकाशवाणी देती है उपभोक्ताओं तक पहुंचने का हर विकल्प।
और अब तो आप घर, दफ्तर या दुकान पर बैठे बैठे कर सकते हैं आकाशवाणी के किसी भी केंद्र के लिए विज्ञापनों की बुकिंग।
आकाशवाणी के विभिन्न चैनलों पर विज्ञापन देना सुलभ और सस्ता।
बुकिंग है तो संपर्क करें 8700014242 पर।
8700014242।
ब्रेक के बाद आपका फिर स्वागत है कार्यक्रम मार्केट मंत्र में। अब बात कर लेते हैं रुपए के प्रदर्शन की। विदेशी मुद्रा बाजार में रुपया आज डॉलर के मुकाबले 35 पैसे मजबूत होकर 82 रुपए 46 पैसे प्रति डॉलर के स्तर पर बंद हुआ। विश्व की 6 प्रमुख मुद्राओं की तुलना में डॉलर की मजबूती दर्शाने वाला डॉलर इंडेक्स 0.17% गिरकर 103.8 पर कारोबार कर रहा था। जयंता, डॉलर के मुकाबले 35 पैसे की आज मजबूती रुपए में है और डॉलर इंडेक्स की अगर हम बात करें तो वो उसमें भी गिरावट का हमें रुख दिख रहा है। किस तरीके से देखते हैं आप?
देखिए, मैं मानता हूं अगर ब्याज दर में खास 50 बेसिस पॉइंट से ज्यादा कोई वृद्धि ना हो तो उसमें डॉलर का इस वक्त जो पोजीशन है उसमें वैसे ही बरकरार रहेगा और साथ में इंडियन रूपी जो है 82 से लेकर 83 के लेवल्स में स्विंग करते रहेंगे, विच इज क्वाइट स्टेबल एट दिस लेवल्स।
We earlier spoke, Jayanta, of inflation, and I think let's just dwell a little more on this. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman today asserted that inflation is declining continuously in the country, benefiting the poor, and the wholesale price index has declined to 5.8%, which is the lowest in the last 21 months. She also said that the government is keeping a close watch on the price situation of essential commodities. She added that inflation was in double digits in earlier regimes, but now, of course, it's come to 5.8%. Buffer stocks of pulses have been maintained for price stabilization. She reiterated that the Indian rupee is strengthening against other currencies by and large, moving within a range. And talking about the supplementary demand for grants, she said it is only 8% of the current budget estimate, and a major part of it is for subsidies on fertilizers, food and public distribution, and for Ujjwala consumers. So when we're talking of inflation now, and we earlier did mention it, coming on to subsidies now, and understanding that we also know there's a call that we should somewhere balance them out, decrease them. What is your call on this?
Well, I mean, see, any rational person obviously would not support subsidies, but there are political compulsions. There are also part economic compulsions too. So it's not something which we write off. But I do believe that at this point of time, it's a huge white elephant in the room. And the government, if you ask me, in terms of policy level, they should bring out a white paper of subsidies and focus on how to taper it off in the next 5 years or with a 10-year roadmap. So if that commitment is there, although it's a very, very tough political call, to take in, I mean, it will create a havoc and a chaos. And we saw what happened when the government tried to tinker with even the prices of MSP and how, the borders of Delhi were under siege for months. So that's a tough call. And as I said, it's a political call. But in terms of economics, obviously there are some economic compulsions also which keep on happening. But then, as I said, if the government has that support to bring in a 5-year, 7-year, 10-year period of how the subsidies can be tapered off, and it can be gradually, substituted by a much more focused, structure in terms of pricing, in terms of supporting and things like that, it would be a much more better scenario. But then I doubt, if you ask me very frankly.
Do you feel over the years, is there greater policy support and people support for?
See, it's a difficult call to take whether it's a increased factor or a decreased factor because it's a changing environment. Now, if you ask me during COVID, of almost 1.5 years of COVID, if the government doesn't offer subsidy, who would? I mean, we saw how millions and millions of workers were caught up in various states. They had to migrate and all. Food was given. Grains were given to them. Every state government, despite their really hallowed coffers, still offered them grains. So those are also subsidies which are being offered right away. Now, if that support is not there, who would give them that support? So, as I said, it's a very tough call. And politically also very difficult for any state government or even central government to take a call on how to reduce and wipe off subsidies. So,
and I think during this tough time, the COVID years, this has really helped people actually get their food, and it's been really...
It sustained them. I mean,
it
sustained them, and that's where nations step in. I mean, rich nations can put in tax subsidies straight away, can give in cash subsidies and cash help. But, in countries like India, you have to stand on the street to offer that bag of grains. And that matters a lot. And I think that goes way beyond any discussion also in terms of the economic impacts, which we should not.
Absolutely.
सब्सिडीज का राजकोष में तो असर पड़ता ही है, लेकिन एक वेलफेयर स्टेट होने के नाते सरकार की भी कर्तव्य है, जिम्मेदारी है कि वो समाज के जो कमजोर वर्ग हैं उनके लिए जरूर कुछ करे। बहरहाल अब रुक करते हैं वैश्विक शेयर बाजारों का। एशियाई शेयर बाजारों की बात करें तो आज एशियाई शेयर बाजारों में हल्की तेजी रही। अमेरिका में नवंबर माह के उपभोक्ता महंगाई आंकड़े मिलने के बाद निवेशकों विश्लेषकों को उम्मीद है कि केंद्रीय बैंक अगले वर्ष की शुरुआत से ब्याज दरों में वृद्धि करना कम करेंगे। दक्षिण कोरिया के कोस्पी में आज 1.1% का उछाल आया और जापान का निकेई 0.7% लाभ में रहा। हांगकांग के हैंगसेंग में 0.4% और सिंगापुर का स्ट्रेट्स टाइम्स 0.2% की बढ़त के साथ बंद हुए। चीन का शंघाई कंपोजिट इंडेक्स बिना किसी उतार चढ़ाव के सपाट बंद हुआ। यूरोपीय बाजारों की बात करें तो अंतर्दिवसीय कारोबार में यहां गिरावट का रुख था। जर्मनी का डेक्स 0.7% की गिरावट में चल रहा था। फ्रांस का कैक 0.6% और लंदन का FTSE 100 0.3% के नुकसान के साथ कारोबार कर रहे थे।
Let's take a quick look at the U.S. market. U.S. stocks rose yesterday after an unexpectedly small consumer price increase increased optimism that the Federal Reserve could soon dial back its inflation-taming interest rate hikes. The Dow Jones Industrial Average added 0.3%. The S&P 500 rose 0.7% and the Nasdaq Composite gained 1%. In oil prices were up around 1% today amid reports of oil demand rebound in 2023 from OPEC and the International Energy Agency IEA. However, signals from data indicating a surprise build in U.S. crude inventories kept gains in a limit. In intraday trade, Brent crude was trading at $81.50 per barrel, while WTI crude prices were at $76.20 per barrel. Jayanta, we've been seeing how oil prices have been moving and, of course, not wanting to talk about the movement, but wanting to understand from you, what is a level which is actually comfortable, because people are saying that we are going to get oil from Russia at a much cheaper rate, and India is using that. So to balance that, is that another tool for the secondary effect on inflation to come in? What would be a good price level?
Well, that's a very difficult call to take because crude prices have to match up with your business environment. It has to match up with the existing interest rate structure and all. But what I do believe is the softening of oil prices is something there in the offing, at least in the next 2-3 months. And domestically, in Indian markets, there was news, I don't know why it didn't happen, of a 5 to 7 rupees slash in oil prices across petrol and diesel and all. That has not happened yet. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it has not happened yet. But there was news in the last 2-3 days that it would happen. Now, what we have to understand is, obviously, any softening of oil prices would lead to better management of our India's forex reserves and things like that, and would also create a little bit of less pressure on the rupee, even at 80 to 83 levels. So it's a no-brainer. But then if there is a looming situation where the world is entering into recessionary mode, oil prices can crash from here. And when I say crash, doesn't mean it go to $50 levels. It can go to $8-10 at least. A 15-20% sharp fall we can expect. So that's something which can happen. But then at this point of time, it's winter and there is a fairly high demand of fuel, which has kept on, the oil prices at these levels. But then, as I said, the chances of it, if recession hits in terms of at least news that yes, these nations are facing these sorts of issues and all, oil prices were the first to move down. So let's not, even think of it as a blink. It will happen.
Right.
और अब बात कर लेते हैं कीमती धातुओं की। मल्टी कमोडिटी एक्सचेंज पर फरवरी अनुबंध के सोने का वायदा भाव आज 40 रुपए टूटकर 54,705 रुपए प्रति 10 ग्राम पर चल रहा था। हालांकि मार्च अनुबंध वाली चांदी 70 रुपए की तेजी से 68,845 रुपए प्रति किलोग्राम के स्तर पर कारोबार कर रही थी। उधर न्यूयॉर्क मर्केंटाइल एक्सचेंज में सोना गिरावट के साथ $1,819.80 प्रति औंस और चांदी $23.90 प्रति औंस पर कारोबार कर रही थी।
Quickly, in a few seconds, because we are towards the close. Gold, do you see the movement as expected?
Yeah, it is. It is as expected. It's a good buy for even the medium term. Now, I've shifted my opinion from long term to medium term. Okay. But it's a very good buy for the medium term sector.
All right. Thank you very much for coming on to our show, Jayanto, and we look forward to the next meeting with you. And now, before we close, a reminder of the headlines. Domestic stocks witness modest gains amid mixed global cues. Sensex closes above 62,650 points. Nifty settles above 18,650 level. Rupee strengthens 35 paise against the US dollar. And Brent crude prices hover around $81.50 per barrel. And that's it in this edition of Market Mantra. Namaskar.
Namaskar.
Market Mantra.